Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So a few times in videos that I've done in the past, in the comments underneath, people have asked me if the Seax is essentially the same or very similar to a Bowie knife. Well, here I have a Seax and here I have a Bowie knife. Now, first of all, what is a Seax? Well, I expect that most of you know what a Seax is. What I am actually holding here is a pattern welded example. I don't know if you'll be able to see the pattern exactly. You probably just about can there. This is a totally sweet blade by a very respected sword and knife maker, and spear maker in fact, called Paul Binns, who makes both weapons and in fact armour as well for reenactment, but also does sharp examples which are essentially museum replicas. And this is a sharp one. As you'll see, yet I haven't got a hilt on it. I'm doing that myself. I'm still trying to decide on the wood to use and so on. The grips, if I just put the Bowie knife down, the grips are fairly long on Saxes, tend to be about that long, or even longer in some cases. Tend to be actually quite basic wood. They don't usually have metal guards, don't usually have metal pommels, at least not the English examples, and this blade is known as a broken back Sax. This is the broken back, and on the continent, i.e. France, Germany and so forth, they, generally speaking, have a slightly different shape. They don't have such a pronounced break at the back, or don't have one at all really, and it's shaped more like a big carving knife, generally speaking, in Frankish lands. And if you go to Scandinavia, they tend to be more sloped at the back rather than as sort of suddenly changing direction as this. So this is quite an English style one, which suits me of course, being English, and it is genuine pattern welding. It's got a carbon steel edge, an iron back, and pattern welded herringbone pattern up the middle. So it's a totally gorgeous blade, and this is like one of the nicest things I've bought in a long time. So I will show it again when I've got a handle on it, which I hope to do imminently. And a Seax was essentially the kind of everyday, pretty much actually similar to a Bowie knife, kind of everyday knife, living knife, should we call it, hunting knife, kind of camping knife, in some cases eating, although you usually have a smaller knife for eating, and if it came to it, a fighting knife as well. This example has a blade of about 12 inches, so it's let's just compare, yeah, it's about 11 or 12 inches. So this, would be the kind of thing that someone might carry as a last resort backup weapon after they've used their spear, and perhaps a sword if they've got one. Of course, many people in the Anglo-Saxon period didn't have swords because they couldn't afford them. Their primary weapons would have been spear and shield. And they traditionally fought on foot, of course. So this would be a very useful backup weapon, and you do get, of course, longer examples than this. Sax, for those who don't know, is generally spelt S-E-A-X, Seax, okay, but it's said Sax. Sometimes you see them called Scramasax, which actually is a term that only turns up in one historical source, so it's kind of tends to be ignored, that term, these days, because it wasn't actually used very much historically. Sometimes they're called Hadsax. The long ones are sometimes called Langsax, but essentially the item is called a Sax. And as I said, you do get kind of machete and sword length ones, but most of them that survive archaeologically are smaller than this. Most of them are only kind of like a kind of average kitchen knife size, because that's pretty much what they were used for. They were used for general purpose household knives. The bigger ones were probably more for hunting and perhaps for warfare. So the Seax actually, as I've already now explained, filled a similar kind of role to the Bowie knife in its time. It was a knife that you might carry travelling or hunting and sometimes fighting. Okay, and yes, there are accounts of Saxes being used in fighting in the Icelandic sagas and such like. And if we actually look at the blades, they are fairly similar. They essentially both have a clipped point. The edges are a similar kind of shape, so they're curved in the last portion of the blade but straight until that point. And indeed, even in the kind of thickness and general size and profile and everything else, they are quite similar. I would say the two main differences between the Seax and the Bowie knife are, first of all, the Bowie knife, very importantly, has a form of handguard. Saxes, whilst there are some continental examples which have hand guards, they are very small, and I wouldn't really necessarily describe them as hand guards so much as they're to prevent your hand from riding up onto the blade. In actual fact, that's true also of Bowie knives. I think very often in literature, the guard on a Bowie knife, it is made too much of in terms of being a hand guard. It's not there as much to protect the hand, really, as it, because to be honest, even with that hand guard there, if you're fighting someone, it's very easy to hit them in the knuckles anyway. The main thing protecting your hand is you, and you not having your hand in the wrong place. Really what the guard is there to do is to prevent your hand riding up onto the blade when stabbing with it. And contrary to lots of people's perceptions, the Bowie knife is primarily a stabbing weapon. Of course it can cut very effectively and was used to cut effectively, but in fighting the point is the most important part of it, I would say. In contrary, I would say that the Seax, that's probably not the case. The very fact that the grips are generally quite long and straight and don't have anything really, or at least most of them don't have anything to prevent your hand from sliding up onto the blade, I suspect that actually in fighting these were not used to stab very much, although it is shown in artwork them being used to stab, but there's not an awful lot to stop your hand accidentally riding up the handle and onto the actual blade itself, which is obviously not very good. Now they do have some similarities to Kyber knives, as indeed Ewart Oakeshott noted himself in Archaeology of Weapons. He notes that, Kyber knives, we know, as I've spoken about in previous videos, historically, despite the fact they look very pointy and they look like they could be very effective at thrusting, there are 19th century surgeons' reports which say they were used for cutting, and they actually go as far as to say that if this was used for thrusting, it would be more fatal, and that, you know, if they wanted to improve their use of this weapon, they should use it for thrusting. However, Afghans in the 19th century, 99 times out of 100, cut with it, and I actually suspect that might be the same with the Seax, because of the fact that there's nothing really to prevent your hand riding up onto the grip if you thrust and meet opposition with it. However, there's lots of stuff unknown about Dark Age weapons, hence the name Dark Ages, which lots of people incidentally oppose the name Dark Ages, and I actually in a way don't have a problem with it, because I know we should call it Migration Era and Viking Era, or perhaps Early Middle Ages, but in actual fact I think Dark Ages is quite descriptive. Everybody knows the term, and I think it kind of earned the term, but the fact that we do have a real lack of source material from that period by and large compared to later medieval period. But anyway, the sort of Dark Age Seax, as I'll call it, there isn't actually very much we know about it. We know about its construction, but we don't really know about its use, certainly not in fighting. So, it is superficially close to or similar to a Bowie knife. I think another point, and the second point I was going to mention, apart from the guard, the other big difference between the Bowie knife and the Seax is Bowie knives pretty much, not always, but pretty much usually have a bevel on the back here, on the false edge, or indeed an edge on the false edge. And Saxes never ever do, as far as I'm aware. I've never seen an example. They're always, don't know if you can see in this light, but they're always completely flat all the way along the back of here. And that is partly to do with their construction as well, because the carbon hard edge is only down the front. At the back here is actually soft iron. Similar-ish in some ways to katana, and indeed to certain other ethnographic weapons that are made in this marrying of steels way. So, so a false edge wouldn't mechanically work very well on the back of a Seax, although you could put one on there. It would certainly cut skin and flesh. It just wouldn't be your hardest steel at the back. You'd have to really put carbon edge around the back as well if you wanted to do that, and that would make it, of course, more like a messer or a falchion. So there we go. I would say by and large, yes, the Seax is broadly similar to a Bowie knife. However, it does have a couple of really important differences, being the guard and the false edge on the Bowie knife, that I think give you a hint that actually probably the Seax wasn't used in a way very similar to the Bowie knife. Whilst it is very pointy, so is a Kyber knife, and Kyber knives we know were used mainly for chopping and slashing. You know, the completely straight grip that you normally get in artwork and what we've got of surviving Seax grips, which there's very few surviving, suggests that there's not a lot to prevent your hand sliding up, so I don't think that thrusting, it certainly wasn't their primary purpose, and even if they were used for thrusting, I don't think they can have been used for thrusting to a degree that influenced their design necessarily. Okay, so there we go guys, I hope that's interesting to some of you, and I'm sure I'll talk more about the Seax in the future, and I'll show you when I've got a grip on this thing. But this blade by Paul Binns, and I should mention Paul Binns is not currently taking orders, his order book is full up, but his stuff is just beautiful and I love it. Cheers guys!